The decision did not arrive with a public speech, a ceremonial warning, or a dramatic palace announcement. It came across a polished table in a sealed crimson folder, carrying the authority of a king who had finally chosen the crown over his wife. When Camilla reached the final paragraph, her expression changed. Charles had severed her last remaining sovereign grant ties permanently, and there would be no appeal. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla did not move. She read the final page once, then again, as though a different meaning might appear. Across from her, Charles kept one hand beside the folder and watched the shock settle across her face. "This is no longer negotiable," he said, quietly enough to make the sentence feel harder. The sovereign grant, the public funding system supporting royal duties, staff, travel, residences, and palace operations, had been the last financial bridge connecting her household to the machinery of the crown. Now that bridge was gone. The king had signed a permanent directive, ending her publicly funded role and ordering that no future allocation be restored in her name. The decision did not simply reduce a budget. It removed her power to authorize spending through the royal household, request grant-supported staff, or attach her office to future official programs. For years, a circle of funded duties had preserved her access to transport, teams, and the influence that came with being treated as part of the monarchy's working core. With one signature, that circle collapsed. She lowered the document and gripped the arm of her chair. Charles saw the moment she understood the order had traveled beyond the room. Senior officials had received copies. Financial codes were waiting to be closed. Staff arrangements were being reviewed. Her silence was not confusion anymore. It was the realization that the decision had been designed to survive anger, persuasion, and reconciliation. William waited beside the king's private secretary, refusing to enter. The prince knew his presence would turn a financial severance into a family confrontation, yet understood what was being decided behind that door. His father was not merely cutting funds. He was changing who could command, appoint, and influence in the monarch's name. Then the deeper danger surfaced. Charles had not acted in a moment of rage. A confidential review had run for months, built from recorded conversations, written instructions, and one incident that destroyed his willingness to protect her. Before that hidden episode could be exposed, however, the emotional cost had to be measured through the three people now trapped at the center of the decision. Behind the language of funding, duty, and constitutional restraint stood something painfully human. A husband withdrawing protection from his wife, a queen watching her public identity collapse, and an heir forced to witness the marriage behind the monarchy fracture in silence. Charles had signed the order as sovereign, but Camilla received it as a personal rejection. William understood both truths, and that made his position almost unbearable. Camilla returned to her private rooms without speaking. She removed her gloves slowly, placed them beside an unopened letter, and asked her longtime aide whether the staff had already been informed. The woman hesitated for only a second, but that second told the queen everything. Her funded office, official household, scheduled engagements, and access to palace systems had never been mere administrative benefits. They had become proof that she belonged at the center of royal life, rather than at its edge. Charles remained behind in the study after she left. He stared at the empty chair across from him, then turned the signed directive face down, as though hiding the words might lessen their force. The king had spent years defending his wife against criticism, shielding her from hostility, and insisting that the institution accept the woman he loved. Yet continued protection now threatened the very authority he was sworn to preserve. The monarchy could survive private unhappiness. It could not survive blurred control over public power. William entered only after the door had closed behind her. The prince understood that supporting the order would deepen Camilla's anger, but resisting it could destroy the financial discipline he intended to impose as future king. He chose his words carefully before asking whether she had been given one final warning. Charles did not look up. "She was given several," he replied. "She simply never believed any of them would be enforced." The answer disturbed William more than anger would have. It meant his father had not acted in panic. He had watched, waited, and reached a conclusion alone. Catherine had already warned her husband during a private conversation that he must not treat the decision as a victory. Humiliation, she told him, could make an isolated person more dangerous, not less influential. The princess understood that Camilla would not see only the king's signature. She would search for the hand she believed had guided it. That suspicion had already taken hold. Camilla was convinced William had pushed Charles into severing her final ties, and every silence from the heir seemed to confirm it. Yet the monarch refused to reveal the evidence that had finally changed his mind, even to his son. He protected the secret, because exposing it too soon would ignite something larger than a family quarrel. That evidence led back to a single ceremony, a private instruction, and the moment Camilla crossed a line, the king could no longer pretend not to see. Every royal rupture has a moment that later becomes impossible to ignore. For Charles, it came during a private reception at Windsor, after the music had stopped and the final guests were leaving. Camilla summoned the deputy treasurer into a side chamber and issued an instruction involving public money, private loyalty, and William's future household. By morning, the request had reached the king, and something inside him had changed. Camilla had resisted the changes for months. She opposed plans to merge communications teams, reduce duplicated offices, and limit engagements financed through public funds, because each reduction weakened the independent structure surrounding her. The sovereign grant, the public funding system that pays for official royal duties, staff, travel, and palace operations, had become more than money. It protected her influence. Charles saw the disputes as administrative friction and repeatedly ordered officials to settle them quietly, fearing that a public clash would expose a deeper fracture inside his marriage. The breaking point came during a Windsor reception honoring Commonwealth volunteers. Camilla drew Deputy Treasurer Martin Halbrook into a private chamber and instructed him to redirect resources from William's transition office into a new permanent unit under her personal authority. That office was preparing the prince for greater responsibility and organizing the staff he would need as future king. So weakening it meant interfering directly with the monarchy's next chapter. Halbrook placed his untouched glass on a side table and asked whether Charles had approved the transfer. The queen consort did not hesitate. "He will understand once it is done," she replied. Martin heard more than confidence in those words. He heard an order built on the assumption that the king's authority could be used first, and explained later. Martin returned to his office that night and documented the exchange in a confidential memorandum. He recorded the requested amount, the staffing plan, and the instruction to keep William uninformed until the allocation had been processed. The deputy treasurer signed the account before midnight, knowing that silence would make him part of the decision. Charles received the memorandum during breakfast the next morning. He read one sentence 3 times, folded the page, and dismissed every aide except his private secretary. The king did not raise his voice. That restraint frightened the man beside him more than anger would have. Charles confronted Camilla that evening, expecting concern or regret. She dismissed the transfer as a practical adjustment and accused palace officials of turning ordinary household management into an attack against her. The monarch listened until she finished, then realized the danger was no longer the money alone. His wife no longer recognized the boundary between marital access and sovereign authority. That response became the point of no return. Charles ordered a complete review of every remaining grant connection attached to her office, and when the findings arrived, they were far more serious than he expected. When he finally placed them before Camilla, the argument that followed stripped away every layer of royal restraint. There were no courtiers to soften the words, no officials to translate anger into formal language, and no ceremonial smiles to preserve appearances. Charles and Camilla faced one another as husband and wife inside a locked sitting room, with the review file lying between them. She believed the decision could still be reversed. He had entered the room knowing it never would be. Charles dismissed every aide from the Clarence House sitting room and closed the door himself. Clarence House was the couple's London residence, but in that moment it felt less like a home than the final place where their private loyalty would be tested against royal authority. Camilla remained seated and spoke with controlled disbelief. She argued that the financial arrangements had supported years of loyal work, public engagements, staff coordination, and charity duties. Removing them, she warned, would not look like reform. It would look like a marriage collapsing in public. Charles opened the review file. He named the Windsor instruction, unauthorized staffing requests, duplicated travel claims, and repeated efforts to preserve a separate power structure around her office. The king spoke without shouting, but every detail made his anger heavier. Camilla listened until William's name appeared, then rose sharply and accused the prince of engineering the entire review. Charles stood at once. "This was my decision," he said. "Do not place my signature in another man's hand." Camilla struck the back of her chair with her palm. She demanded to know whether decades of loyalty now meant nothing, whether every humiliation she had endured could be erased by a folder of figures and memoranda. The monarch did not retreat. He told her loyalty could not become permission to spend, appoint, or command in the sovereign's name. The sovereign was the person who legally carried the crown's authority, and Charles believed that authority had been borrowed too often without his clear consent. Camilla stared at him, wounded and furious, until he delivered the sentence that ended every defense. "You did not merely use the grant. You used my crown to make others obey you." Silence followed. She tried one final compromise, offering to surrender staff positions while keeping a narrow official financial link. Charles refused, because even a small surviving connection could later be expanded, protected, and rebuilt. The queen consort realized then that he was not negotiating terms. He was closing the path entirely. Charles removed his signet pen from the table and placed it inside his coat. The pen carried his personal mark of authority, and the gesture made the ending feel final before he spoke. "The directive takes effect at midnight." Camilla moved toward the door, then stopped. "William will regret what follows," she said. Charles watched her leave and understood the most dangerous truth of all. She still blamed the heir, not the choices that had brought them there. Yet his signature alone could not make the severance permanent. Behind it stood a financial mechanism designed to prevent even the king from quietly reversing it later. Royal power often appears absolute from the outside, but Charles understood that a private promise could be weakened, delayed, or undone by the pressures of family. So he built a lock around his own decision. The order did not simply remove Camilla from the sovereign grant. It placed the severance inside a financial structure that neither affection, persuasion, nor a future reconciliation could casually reverse. Charles summoned the keeper of the privy purse, the royal treasurer, and senior household auditors before the directive became active. The keeper of the privy purse was the official responsible for managing the monarch's private and official finances, which meant his approval would turn the king's order into a working reality. Every funding code tied to Camilla's independent office was to be terminated. Any future duty involving her would require separate written approval, preventing a permanent staff structure or open-ended public allocation from quietly returning. Sir Jonathan Reeve read the directive in silence. He stopped at one word, looked across the table, and asked whether "permanent" should remain in every copy. Charles met his eyes without hesitation. "Especially in the copies that survive me," he replied. Jonathan understood the weight of that answer. The monarch was not merely controlling the present. He was binding the future. William entered the financial briefing expecting details, but found a clause aimed directly at his eventual reign. The prince could not restore Camilla's old arrangement after accession without a full independent review. Accession meant the moment he would become king, and the restriction ensured that grief, guilt, or political pressure could not erase the decision overnight. William studied the clause before asking whether his father distrusted him. Charles shook his head. The king explained that the protection worked both ways. It would stop the future monarch from appearing vindictive if he refused Camilla, and it would stop others from using her position as a bargaining tool after Charles was gone. The answer did not remove the tension, but it made the purpose brutally clear. Charles then transferred several shared charitable and ceremonial budgets into one unified office, controlled jointly by his household and William's transition team. The move mattered because those funds had once allowed Camilla's staff to act with wide independence. Now every request would leave a record. Every approval would have two sets of eyes, and no private instruction could hide inside a familiar routine. Jonathan revealed through a documented staffing report that two senior members of her office had already been told their publicly funded contracts would end. The decision had been operating before Camilla ever entered the study. She had not been invited to negotiate. She had been summoned to receive the final result. Jonathan closed the briefing with one warning. Once the codes were shut at midnight, the consequences would move instantly through payroll, transport, staffing, and engagements already written into the royal calendar. And when midnight arrived, Camilla discovered that the loss was not symbolic. Doors that had opened for years began closing one after another. At midnight, nothing dramatic sounded through the palace corridors. No bell rang. No announcement was read. Yet across secure systems, payroll lists, transport schedules, office rosters, and engagement files, Camilla's authority disappeared line by line. By breakfast, the queen who had once commanded an entire household could not confirm a journey without written approval, and the reality of Charles's decision became brutally personal. Camilla asked for the morning car schedule, as she always had. Her aide paused before explaining that the vehicle assignment had been withdrawn until the central household approved it. The central household was the king's main administrative office, now responsible for reviewing every journey, engagement, and expense previously controlled by her private team. That change mattered, because her duties were not automatically cancelled, but none could move forward without another office deciding whether public funds should support them. Camilla took the printed page and found her name replaced by 3 words, "Subject to approval." She stared at them, tore the sheet once, then placed both pieces neatly on the desk. The controlled gesture carried more anger than shouting. Her travel budget had closed, staffing contracts were frozen, and her office no longer had permission to launch sovereign grant-funded engagements. The machinery she once directed now treated her as a request, waiting to be judged. Helen Markham entered moments later, struggling to keep her voice steady. The private secretary explained that 4 employees had received termination notices, and 2 others had been offered positions outside Camilla's authority. Helen had served her through years of public pressure, so delivering the news felt less like administration and more like betrayal forced through her own mouth. Camilla asked whether Charles had approved every name personally. Helen answered that the entire restructuring carried the king's authorization. The queen consort looked away, understanding that no sympathetic official could be blamed. Her husband had not merely signed a broad order, he had accepted the human cost attached to it. The first public consequence arrived before noon. A planned solo visit to a literacy charity was postponed because no approved funding code remained. Camilla had supported the organization for years, and the empty space in her calendar would expose the change beyond palace walls. She could endure private humiliation. Public absence was harder, because absence could quickly become irrelevance. William learned of the cancellation through a documented briefing from his staff. The prince immediately ordered them not to celebrate, leak details, or brief journalists against her. He insisted that the monarchy could enforce discipline without appearing to enjoy suffering. Yet his restraint could not soften what had already happened. Camilla made one unexpected decision. She did not challenge the officials, demand another review, or summon lawyers. Instead, she requested a private meeting with Charles in the garden room, alone, without secretaries, financial advisors, or William nearby. For the first time since the order was signed, she was no longer preparing a defense. She was preparing to tell Charles what the crown had cost them both. The turning point did not come through another order or another confrontation. It came when Camilla entered the garden room without files, notes, or an aide at her shoulder. Charles was already waiting. For several minutes, neither spoke. Stripped of officials and constitutional language, they were no longer sovereign and queen. They were two aging people facing the possibility that power had damaged the one loyalty they once believed could survive anything. Camilla sat opposite him and admitted what she had never said during the argument. She believed her position would always be protected because Charles had spent so many years fighting to secure it. The crown had once resisted her presence, yet he had defended her until acceptance finally became official. That history mattered because every funded office, scheduled duty, and loyal aide had come to feel like proof that she could never again be pushed to the edge. Charles lowered his gaze. The king acknowledged that he had helped create that belief by defending her so fiercely that the line between emotional protection and institutional permission had slowly disappeared. Institutional permission meant the formal authority to spend public money, direct royal staff, or act through the monarchy's official systems. His love had offered safety, but over time, she had begun treating that safety as permanent power. Camilla removed her wedding ring and placed it between them. She asked whether he had removed her from the crown or from his life. The monarch reached forward, pushed the ring gently back toward her, and answered that the marriage remained. Her independent financial authority did not. Camilla finally confessed that the Windsor demand had come from fear. William's growing power made her believe that her influence, her staff, and eventually her place in royal history would be erased. The prince's transition office represented the monarchy after Charles, and every expansion around the future king felt like another door closing against her. Charles listened, then gave the answer she had avoided. Trying to secure permanence through public funds had created the very isolation she feared. Every act of support now looked compromised. Every defense appeared purchased through authority. The more tightly she held the machinery of the crown, the less secure her place beside him became. Camilla made her decision. She would not challenge the directive or continue plans for a competing legal review. Through a documented instruction to her private secretary, she ordered those preparations abandoned and requested that departing employees receive compensation from her personal funds. Charles accepted the request, but refused to restore even the smallest official tie. Compassion would remain. The severance would also remain. Camilla placed the ring back on her finger. "Then let it end cleanly," she said. The words did not repair what had broken, but they ended the battle between them. Yet the private peace inside that room could not contain the shock outside, where one headline was about to turn a palace rupture into a national judgment. By dawn, the private order belonged to the world. Broadcasters abandoned scheduled royal coverage, commentators filled studio panels, and crowds gathered beneath the palace gates, searching for signs of movement. Yet one front page captured the crisis with devastating simplicity. A photograph of Camilla leaving alone beneath the words, "The king closes the account." For the palace, the financial decision had become a public verdict. The London Chronicle published the image beneath a black border, turning one private departure into a symbol of national judgment. The headline dominated the page, while smaller text explained that the queen consort would continue selected duties without an independent sovereign grant allocation. That meant she could still serve publicly, but she could no longer control a separate pool of taxpayer-supported money, staff, travel, or official planning. The distinction mattered because the crown was not removing her identity. It was removing her financial independence within the institution. Eleanor Marsh opened the BBC Morning Bulletin with words that sharpened the crisis further. The presenter called the directive the most consequential financial separation inside the modern royal household. Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd gathered beneath the gates. One woman raised a handwritten sign reading, "Public duty, public rules," while another placed flowers nearby for Camilla. The divided gestures captured the country's mood. Some saw overdue accountability. Others saw a husband publicly stripping dignity from the woman he had once promised to protect. Camilla watched the coverage beside Helen Markham without speaking. The private secretary remained close, as studio guests debated whether the decision had exposed a parallel center of power around her office. When one commentator called it a parallel court, the Queen reached for the remote and switched off the television. Helen tried to offer reassurance, but she refused it. Sympathy could not erase a phrase millions had already heard. Charles received the front page during breakfast. The king studied the headline, then folded the paper inward until his wife's photograph disappeared. He accepted the policy and every consequence attached to it, but the spectacle disturbed him. Discipline had become humiliation, and the line between the two was now being drawn by strangers. William responded with immediate restraint. The prince ordered that no member of his team discuss the confidential review, the Windsor instruction, or Camilla's reaction with journalists. He knew silence would not stop speculation, but it would prevent the future king's household from appearing to feed it. The palace then released a concise statement confirming that official expenditure would be centralized. Camilla would continue selected duties, but no independent grant allocation would return. Hours later, she proceeded with a privately funded literacy meeting at Clarence House, proving she would not disappear. Charles watched a recording of that appearance and understood the final truth. The severance had not destroyed her public role. It had forced it into a smaller, harder, but more honest form. With the nation watching and the financial ties permanently closed, only one judgment remained: whether he had saved the crown at her expense or finally saved them both from a dangerous illusion. In the end, Charles did not remove Camilla from royal history, erase their marriage, or deny the years she had stood beside him. He did something more precise and more painful. He drew a permanent boundary between love and sovereign power. Camilla lost the financial protection she believed proved her belonging, but the monarchy regained a principle it had nearly sacrificed. No personal relationship could stand above public duty. The Midnight Directive remained fully in force. Her independent sovereign grant office was dissolved, its funding codes were closed, and its former duties were absorbed into the central royal household. The sovereign grant was the public funding system supporting official royal work, staff, travel, and palace operations. Losing that structure meant Camilla could still serve, but she could never again command a separate publicly funded operation around herself. Several weeks later, Camilla entered Charles's study before a small charity reception and placed a privately paid event ledger on his desk without being asked. The Queen had funded the meeting through her personal resources, and every expense had been recorded. Charles read the first page, closed the ledger, and told her she no longer needed to prove that the order had been obeyed. Camilla kept her hand on the cover. "Obedience is not the point," she replied. "Clarity is." The answer revealed how much had changed. Charles no longer protected his wife through institutional privilege, and she no longer treated financial access as proof of emotional security. Their marriage survived, but it survived without the dangerous illusion that affection could grant unlimited authority. The king remained beside her as a husband. The crown no longer stood behind every demand she made. William met Camilla privately soon afterward. The prince told her plainly that he had not requested her removal, designed the review, or persuaded his father to sign the directive. She listened before admitting that blaming him had been easier than accepting that Charles had reached the decision alone. Camilla offered no apology for fearing that history might erase her, but she acknowledged that her Windsor instruction had crossed a boundary. Charles later delivered his final judgment during a documented private conversation with his secretary. The monarch said the order had not been punishment for the past, it had been protection for the future, ensuring that love, guilt, or loyalty could never again create a second center of authority inside the royal household. The monarchy emerged smaller, more centralized, and more accountable. Camilla emerged wounded, but no longer dependent on public funding to validate her place beside the king. William inherited a future crown, with one dangerous uncertainty removed. The account was closed, the authority was returned, and the silence that once divided them became acceptance. Not victory, not revenge, but the final recognition that the crown could only endure when even those closest to it were willing to live within its boundaries. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.